Okay, everybody, we are going to get started here this morning. I'm going to bring up Alex Gorodetsky, who's going to introduce our first speaker.
Everyone, welcome back. So I have the pleasure of introducing Nyalleng Moorosi. Nyalleng Moorosi is a senior researcher at DAIR, which is the Distributed AI Research Institute. And her research interests are in understanding how we can build models which center populations often regarded as peripheral. Before DAIR, she was a research software engineer at Google, where she was one of the first employees at Google Africa Research Lab. She has also been a senior researcher at the South African Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, where she worked closely with government and academic institutions to develop diversity of products for private and public institutions. Outside of formal work, she is involved in efforts to democratize AI. She is a founding member of the Deep Learning Indaba, the largest machine learning consortium of AI ML practitioners in Africa, a member of A Plus Alliance, an international coalition that seeks to not only detect but correct gender bias in artificial intelligence. So with that, please take it away.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Thanks for nodding. I saw the nod. Yes, thank you so much for this invitation. I wish I had been able to make it in person, but it was a little difficult to travel with everything. So my name is Nyalleng Moorosi. I'm a research fellow at the Distributed AI Research. And today I'm going to talk to you about something I've been thinking about for a couple of, well, it would happen that it's been a couple of years coming now. But in the last 2 years, it's really come to the fore. And it is this idea of, moving away from creating these imaginary realities using AI for people in the global south. And basically, a lot of the time, it's just people who are not very well known or well recorded by the primary producers of AI. Um, it is a twofold thing. It's like both, how do we stop creating these imaginary realities? Because obviously we have to create them because we don't have enough information about these people. So we kind of have to keep supplementing and creating what we think is the reality. But then the second thing is how do we support and what do we get if we focus a little bit more on building locally? Okay, so a little bit about what has informed my lens. So, a couple of years ago, I suppose now maybe it's like almost 10 years ago, I used to be a researcher at the government research lab in South Africa. And there I used to develop, back then there was called like data science tools. But I used to develop, different products, of course, still using machine learning. We're always updating terminology for government departments, from the Department of Science to the Department of Home Affairs, handling issues such as identity fraud for the Department of Home Affairs, Department of Science, building for them like language models, automated like budget tools, things like those. So that was one of the things that informed my lens about how do you build better when you're one, working with public data, and then secondly, building tools that are going directly to the people and the people do not know that you're building for them. And there's a lot of decisions that you have to make as the person who builds this about what you optimize and what you leave out. And being given this much power over, national agenda was actually something that really brought me back to the thinking of what exactly is it that we're doing when we're saying that we're optimizing. What are we optimizing for? I am from Lesotho, so this is funny actually speaking to Americans about Lesotho, given the last comments which were trending online from the president. So that's a little funny. But anyway, I am from Lesotho. So I'm calling you actually from somewhere between the border of Lesotho and South Africa. That's primarily where I live. I'm a person who lives in both countries. My parents, are from both countries, my child and my entire family, as is the story of many border people the world over. I am also the co-founder of the Deep Learning Indaba, which is the largest machine learning consortium in Africa. We started this in 2017 when we realized that AI was going to be a thing. And we thought there was a skill shortage here for our fellow Africans. And we started building that. And now it's a thing that has a life of its own. And it has created other consortiums and it has created startups. And it's actually really wonderful. We're seeing a lot of work that comes from the people that are being published in top machine learning conferences and that's like one of the things that has given many of us a great joy to see this level of participation. And you'll see that a lot of my work actually comes from the challenge that we see when people actually build from outside, I suppose, in. So some of my work also, the kind of work that I was interested in when it comes to just like foundational machine learning stuff. One of the projects that I think it was really illuminating that I worked on was about what we lose when we compress a model. Where are our first points of failure when you compress a model? Model compression was a thing that was very interesting for me because I am often building for areas that are low resource, low compute. And so anytime we can optimize on that, we can create smaller but more powerful models. That's always a place I'm very happy for. So we took on this project. I remember this was when I was at Google. We took it on with Sarah Hooker to look at, what do you lose when you compress? And we started a couple we were looking at a couple of data sets. One of those is the Celeb A data set. And we found out, of course, shouldn't be too much surprise that actually the underrepresented data are going to be the first place where you make mistakes. And I mean, if you're familiar with compression, you know that you can retain well over 90% accuracy when you compress your model. Even if you compress, you lose like 90% of the model, like you're left with only 10% of the capacity. You will retain that much of overall accuracy, but there will be places where you fail, and those places where you fail will be the underrepresented and the marginal data points. The second place that really was very interesting for me and led me to this whole thing that about what is the developer doing and how do we prioritize how and what we learn and what do we compensate for was this project that we also did. This one was about, so this was still inside Google. This was about how do you create diverse search outputs and how do you, and what kind of metrics do you use to create diverse search results. So I did a little search yesterday about like a human cell, and this is the first result you see. As you can see, this is the basic textbook, image of what a human cell looks like. It's not a very diverse representation of a human cell. For example, you're not seeing very many, for example, neural cells. You're not also seeing, for example, reproductive cells. So you see this a lot, right? We're trying to address this sort of thing where a lot of the time when you perform search, you get this stereotypical response. But how do you diversify this? And to do this, we looked at, for example, theories from social choice, which actually, funny enough, has become such a big topic now within model alignment a lot and all of that. But basically what social choice gives you is a way to decide on what is the thing you prioritize the most. So is the thing you prioritize the most the likelihood that the people are going to click on the results? And so then you can think about it as something like a utilitarian type of thing. Or is it going to be that you want to make sure that the least represented examples become the most visible and examples, right? Like you make sure that they are visible. So in the search results. So this would be a sort of like egalitarian thing where you're making sure that you're boosting up the least common, the least visible examples in order to truly like add diversity and to accommodate non-standard searches or like people who are very interested in specific things. So so this was the thing. But what was interesting for me was about how different you get the results, like how different the results you display are based on the metric that you choose, based on the thing that you want to optimize, based on your own value system about what is the right representation, what does that look like, what is the right feedback that you should be sending to people. But the true spark of all of this happened. This was I think this is why this topic was always still kind of like boiling. And I mean, I remember at the time, I didn't even like think this was a thing. But basically, this is, very well known. South Africa is a very unequal society. And interestingly, you can actually see these neighborhood separations just from like the images. So there was this series of images that was like posted and was being discussed about, what the legacy of spatial separation and the policies of that did to the country. And I was thinking, this was in 2016, 17, something like that, thinking like, oh, and this was the time of, convolutional neural networks, and we're getting serious about computer vision. And I was thinking it'd be really interesting to be able to see if we can, automatically separate out these neighborhoods. At the time, it was very difficult to characterize neighborhoods, especially in Africa. I remember there was this in 2018, I think there was like this competition called Deep Globe. And there was this competition to develop the most accurate neighborhood detection models. And I think the best performing, there was one of the cities that were included that were from Africa at the time was Khartoum in Sudan. And the model that performed the best was like 40% accurate. And this is compared to, for example, the models which were getting well over 90% in over Vegas. But I thought, we know the world, we know this country, and I think we can go on and analyze this. So basically, our research question was this: can we classify these neighborhoods according to their type? We didn't particularly have the entire ground truth. And so we didn't exactly have the data. And this is very, of course, this is very descriptive. This is very exemplary of how we build when you build in the low resource context. A lot of the time, there's not enough data, and you have to really go find the data yourself many times. But I included this little dot here to say that, and this is something that came back later. I realized that we actually had a fairly big a bias about what we regarded as the correct classification of neighborhoods. So as I said, South Africa is very diverse in terms of the kinds of built environments you're going to get. One of the things that was very clear at first was that in the fairly well-off neighborhoods, which look like, neighborhoods in the US and in Europe, our model was really great. But when it came to the models which were like mixed income, that's where we struggled a lot. At the time, a lot of the models that were being built in Africa were like detecting informal settlements versus formal settlements, or measuring poverty using satellite imagery and amount of light at night. These very coarse measurements. And we wanted to get something that was, a little bit more, what's the word? Sometimes my words run away. Something that was a little bit more granular. Yes, that's the word I'm looking for. And so, we decided we were actually not going to release anything. This was not a conscious decision. And I mentioned this because this is part of what this discussion is about. It's about what do we prioritize how do we decide when it's good enough? And for us, we decided it wasn't good enough if it could not properly classify townships. Townships are the historically Black neighborhoods in urban South Africa. And currently now they are very mixed income. And we were like, if we can't detect a township, they're such a big part of what South Africa is, then I don't think we can say that we're able to classify neighborhoods in South Africa. And we held on to that. And I think there were so many times we could have published, but we didn't publish. But basically, we went on and we created our own ground truth. Then, we had a little, we had a little data set from like a utility company, which just had like a dot over a house. And so we started to, locate all of these houses from satellite imagery. We buffed them together in order to create neighborhoods, and even the size of the buffing was something that we had to iterate over in order to learn. We wanted to be as tight as possible and not to spill over, because one of the things we wanted to highlight was the amount of vacant land in the country. And then we went on, and then we decided, and then we assigned each one of these buildings to a specific neighborhood. Now, historically, it had been such that neighborhood, so not necessarily like historically, like currently, after the end of apartheid, when South Africa got its independence, both the townships and the suburbs were grouped together as formal residents, and they are formal residents. But the problem was that they were so different in so many ways. Of course, historically they'd been different, but even the legacy of that, they'd been so different in so many ways. And for many policy, any kind of policy you want to do, we felt that it's going to be more interesting if we can separate them. And so that was one of the first things that we did. We really wanted to split up, for example, townships from suburbs. And we have other neighborhoods, of course. There's farms, there's villages, there's industrial areas and all of that. Our ability to, and this was the thing that made us, like, of course, coupled with the fact that we didn't have data and we were working with very limited compute resources, but it was really this thing of separation, and we wanted to be able to do separation. And like later on, currently what we're working on is the results of us being able to separate. But if you want to see more about this work, we published a research paper in 2021. We currently have a bunch of people who are using this data to study, epidemiology. We've got media outlets. Of course, the issue of land in South Africa is, of course, very political. So sometimes, we submit this and we talk to media outlets. MIT Tech did a little report on this, and there's a whole bunch of other places you can have a look at. From the DAIR website, you'll be able to see some of this. And our work won the Mozilla Rise 25 for our research leader, who was at the beginning of this, my master student, and I was at CSIR. So this year, currently she's doing her PhD in Miller, and she won this award, which was really fantastic. But what we now have, now that we have been able to separate out these neighborhoods, is that now we can trace through the Constitution of South Africa and be able to trace what is the access to these fundamental human rights that are noted in the Bill of Rights. The right to health, the right to education, the right to clean and livable environment. So now, because we can do this, so now we can do a comparative study of who has access to what in the country and how far are they from it. So that as the government is working towards righting the injustices of the past or whatever, but whatever, or other people, it's a great data set for research. But so now we are specifically looking at mapping some of these things. How far are you from health facilities, education, how crowded each of the schools are, and doing this kind of comparative analysis based on this data set. So for example, this is the current project that we're kind of working with, and now we're partnering up with local hospitals. And now we're able to visualize things like these. So on the x-axis is the type of hospital. So this is just an example plot that we've got. And then on the y-axis, we've got the type of neighborhoods. And so, for example, we can see that rural neighborhoods really have the worst access to health, to either one of these hospitals. They are far away from each one of these hospitals. And so it would make sense to build a clinic closer by, to make sure that at least the primary health part, the emergency part is handled locally. And you can see, so now this is the kind of things that we're able to do. Obviously, this is a bird's eye. This is, and it's all about then what is inside the hospital in terms of like actual access. The other thing is that now we're able to contribute to policy. There was a whole thing that, uh, academic, researchers were doing for this one. It's the biggest hospital in South Africa and actually the biggest in Southern Hemisphere. It's this Chris Hani Hospital that's located next to one of the townships in Johannesburg. And they had just lost their cardiac surgery wing. And it was a whole thing of like, making a case that it needs to be established very quickly instead of busing patients to the other hospitals. So with this kind of thing, we're now able to like plot out. And so we just like plotted out all these hospitals along the highway and all of so the bottom diagram down here is, for example, where this hospital is and the township where it's at. The second one over is the Johannesburg city. And then as you move on, it's other places where actually more and more people are being bused to. But because we have this now, we can estimate the population that you now have to be transporting that are now sharing these resources, and we can really enrich these kinds of discussions. So this was what we did and where we are now, but there was a bit of a reflection coming back to this. Part of the reflection actually came from some of the comments, the classic reviewer number 2, when you submit a paper. So when we submitted our paper, one of the things was like, this cannot be machine learning. There's too much tinkering. There's too many, like these people did a bit too much. It cannot still be defined as science. And we did. We did. We redefined the ground truth. Like I said, the government had classified neighborhood as one thing. We were like, no, this can't be that. And then we decided to actually consult the community around. So that was one of the places where we decided who's the expert here. And, to give us more information about these neighborhoods that they live in, because we were developing, we were reclassifying townships as a whole different entity that was not before. We decided on the granularity of what we define as a neighborhood. And then, of course, at the end, like I said, we decided on what's good enough to publish, but also, what results were good enough. These are things that we do, of course, as researchers, we do them routinely. But it brought, having being questioned about them, it brought a certain level of consciousness to these decisions. And I think a big thing was about when we realized how much contextual information we had put into this problem, which is supposed to be a problem of just data and observation. Currently, so that was a problem that we started way back in 2017. It's still alive, of course, but we see this sort of thing again. So this is from the Data Provenance Project, which is led by MIT and a couple of other research institutes. For example, I know Cohere for AI is part of this. And it's looking at, where is the language data coming from, which languages are the most well represented. I think actually this map is wrong because there's very good data sets, of course, over, Chinese but anyway, but basically for me, I mostly posted this because it's on average, it's on average A-okay. I'm not gonna say quite correct. Where we see this sort of thing once again, where it's now in languages. So the one example I was doing was in images, but now even in the language space, we see that there's still a lack of data coming out of Africa, coming out of Latin America, coming from indigenous populations. And now the question is still about how do we still build here? What are the people doing? How do we not how do we not get to a place of building things that are not actually practical and not true? And one of the things that about all of those light, I remember sitting in my office at the CSI while I was still in South Africa, looking at this paper about nighttime assessment of wealth. And I was like, this is so wrong in South Africa. Because in South Africa, the most policed neighborhoods have very good lights, very wide streets. So you've got these wide and you have perfectly graded neighborhoods. This is what townships look like. So you're going to think those are the wealthiest neighborhoods, but actually townships are not very wealthy. So it's like these kinds of things where you have the contextual understanding of the problem. But like when people just look at it from outside, it doesn't always translate. So this is the basics of building local solutions, right? We're building niche, but also we're building with low resources, right? There is no ground truth many times. There is, limited financial, computational, and then political resources. Political resources have become something that's become really important currently as we study more and more how people build differently and better for themselves. We actually find that these kinds of stories do not make it to the media as much as the stories of the people who are building for scale. And of course, both of those are very necessary. You also have to test the scale, but also sometimes it is important to go for depth. So when we're building, one of the things we observed as we were building, locally is that there's a lot of labor. I mean, we had to ask so many people to help us label all of this. There's a lot of labor involved. Financially, it's expensive. I mean, perhaps not as expensive as training a really, really large language model, but like for the people who are building, these are really significant budget requests. It requires regular updates, of course, because you're trying to build for specificity, right? So like as things are changing, you need to make sure that you're maintaining this. And then one of the things that's become a big issue now is about data sovereignty. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to build this very granular, really, data sets, but it's very difficult for these small entities to sustain themselves and make sure that the data that they do raise actually benefit them and the people that they want to build for. On the flip side also, so speaking about how we have been really moving into the world of the imaginary. I mean, this whole thing of like imaginary, it came after, last year, back in early last year, was it January or February? I think it was February, when Google, released Gemini, and Gemini was, changing things and changing people's histories and all of that. And many researchers in machine learning, they pointed out that actually this is not a thing about being woke, or whatever the word is called. It's not that. It's the thing of smoothing, right? It's the thing of transfer learning. It's like if you lack information in one space, in one information space, then you are actually going to do a bunch of transferring from the well-represented states to the less represented states, right? And when you do that, you have to have some kind of an assumption that these knowledge transfers, these information transfers actually hold, right? And the information transfer can come in many different ways, right? Like even now in languages, we've got this cross-lingual transfer, right? Where you train multiple languages in one model. And the hope is that then you can borrow the knowledge and the representation from the well-represented languages in order to augment the information in the low resource languages. And there is you have to maintain this assumption that those augmentations hold. That if you do a cross translation, that the way you translate that holds in order for that information to still be valid. This is the part that I say is really imaginary, because you are a lot of the time, if you're not sitting within these communities, you're going to be augmenting systems that you really do not know, and you're hypothesizing that I think this is a-okay, right? I think this reads a-okay, but sometimes some of those concepts do not exist in this language. Or sometimes that is not the structure of this language. So we have all of these methods, which are incredible, right? They're incredible. And yet, for example, what I have on the left is the performance of GPT-4 over on world languages. And you can see a very, very light shade over Africa, right? It's not quite getting there. So, and one of the reasons is perhaps there's just that we have to get also to a point of just realizing that sometimes there is way, way too little information, right? But so this is like, for example, this was on language identification detection, right? Like just like figuring out what language is this text. And that is a very important thing, right? Because that's how we automate web scraping for languages, right? You have to be able to detect and say, oh, this is French. And then you put it on the French data set, right? Or this is this. And then, but like, for example, GPT-4, this is the performance on that specific task. There was a group of researchers, for example, who came together in Africa, and they built this AfriLead. It was I think her name, the lead author is Ife Adebar, I think so. But anyway, so she and her colleagues, they built together this AfriLead. And this is just the task. They just decided they're going to make this performance better. And one of the things they did is they went and they collected the data. But there's something about collecting the data, right? One of the things I remember, I was talking to my colleague at DAIR. One of the things that happens is when you know the language for which you want to build, when you know the language for which you're collecting, you are able to understand what is missing. And you also understand what are the difficult things that I do not yet know about this language. We see this time and again. Another friend of ours, they have this startup called Lelapa AI, which is a big startup in South Africa. One of the things she said was, we were running into this data shortage. We brought in linguists, right, who understand the structure of the Southern African Bantu languages. They were building for Zulu and Xhosa. And because of that, I mean, currently Lelapa is building the best language models in the world for Southern African languages, right? And it's this contextual understanding of understand what is missing. And this has been, of course, this is basically how we learn. And this is something that is not as much part of the discussion. I think when we are speaking about the larger systems which ingest so much data, we forget that the learning process requires both context, which of course, if you're going to think about it as Bayesian learning, right? If you're going to think about it, then that's the prior, right? You're learning over what you already know. There's contextual information about approximately where you think the solution is going to be, right? Like where in the solution space, where is the likely space for my hypothesis? We do this, right, by using, you can use the context. Then the data comes in to augment, to update, right, in order for us to update on that posterior probability. But there is a prior probability which comes from you understanding the world in which you're built, right? Doctors do this all the time. That's the classic example of disease diagnostic, right? A doctor is trained, they observe symptoms, and then based on the lab tests, which are now the additional data, then they update what they think is the diagnosis. So we see a lot of this sort of thing. So Lesan is this startup that was in the news in 2023 about how it was performing so much better than, for example, Google Translate. And the builder of Lesan, one of the things he said to me was, Nyalleng, one thing I realized was that like these systems are really bad at detecting names. They could not understand like the names in Amharic and Tigrinya. And so one of the things is I'm gonna optimize and make sure that I cover the namespace, the named entity space, make sure that we get really good at that. And he's able to build better because of that. We see this all the way through in Africa. Where a lot of these startups are able to build better because they know where to look, and because they are willing, and they're not only just willing, also it is more accessible for them to build better data sets, right? Because they are actually within the communities. So I actually wrote a reflection about this, about how we are seeing so many people build better because they understand the context. And I think this was the thing, even for us, we were able to build a better geographical neighborhood classification model because we knew, one of the things we knew that was special about townships was that you were not going to be able to detect like the boundaries, the yard boundaries as easily because, you're going to have like houses along the boundaries, things like these. We were like, okay, so now we have to make sure that we're really training this thing on like yard boundary detection. And then when it can do that, then we're going to get closer. It's like this sort of information that you just know because you know what the world looks like for which you're building. So one of the things that's really truly there is we might have limited recorded data, but there is so much contextual information. And this is the leverage, right? Like this is the leverage. Many times this has been the thing of the learning process. With limited data, then you have got to lean on the context in order to inform you a little bit better. So for example, in this reflection that I wrote about, for example, during COVID-19, we had researchers who were using terminology about how people speak about respiratory diseases, which didn't involve any like coughing or temperatures or whatnot. It was just like colloquial speak. And one of these researchers, who's a professor at Boston U, but she's original from Cameroon. One of the things she did was, she collected all of this list of words, and she was able to build a comprehensive data set, like a search keys, and you search them over Google. She's able to build a better data set, and now you can move forward in modeling how COVID-19 was moving in Cameroon. So the other thing that I have found that I think is very interesting and requires some kind of reflection is about the prioritization, what to build for. When there is limited resources, you absolutely have to prioritize, because you are not going to be able to build for everything. And you're not going to be able to search and make sure that everything is covered. So you see this kind of prioritization. People are like, I'm going to build for, I'm going to build for privacy, or somebody, because, I don't know if I will be able to train on well and secured system. I don't know if I can afford to have everything sitting on AWS or Google Cloud and everything being secure, and I'm able to update and all of this sort of thing. So, maybe I want to build just, one of the people we talked to, was this lady from Argentina, and she's like, you know what? I just decided to build in-house. Don't put the things online, because she was building for court, for courts in Argentina on domestic violence and gender-based violence. She's like, this is such sensitive data. I'm not even going to employ other people. I'm going to build with court staff, and this thing will just run locally. That was something that she did, because she's like, I can't assure anything else, but privacy is paramount for me over scale, over many other things. And we start to see how these things really now that we're talking about the AI alignment problem, right? It is about what do we value, right? We've been talking about fairness and bias and this and all of these things, and they've all kind of come down into this whole thing about AI alignment. What are the values that we want these systems to share with us, right? What do we want them to display? How do we want them to behave? And I mean, many who are familiar with, once again, game theory and social choice and these kinds of disciplines, very well that a lot of the time, one of the best ways to do this is to open it up, right? Like the more democratic, I mean, like these are systems that study, for example, which voting mechanisms we should have, or very, very big decisions about what we think is optimal for society. We have now moved to that level of complexity in managing and governing AI, right? And I found it very interesting, because each one of these builders has come at it as something, like, I care about scale. I want to cover as many people as possible. Somebody's like, I care about precision. Or somebody's like, I want to make sure that the AI I build, addresses the elders in my community, like the language model I build addresses the elders in my communities proper. These kinds of very, very privatized and personal values, we start to see people build into them. And this then moved us into, I mean, we knew, like I said, we had that massive bias. We were very interested in how townships have been and how they've been unfolding since 1996. And so we wanted to meet other people. And so we started to run these kinds of sessions. Our first one, I guess I started the other way around. This one we just held now. We were at RightsCon with a couple of other researchers, and we really wanted to think, what changes when you think about these kinds of questions locally. And we invited, for example, Luciana is a researcher in University of Cordoba, and she works on language modeling. And one of the things she's been thinking about as a professor and also a researcher is, how do I integrate tools such as ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude into my students' learning in such a way that they're useful and not punitive as a professor, right? Because there's issues of what's the word? The more I speak English, the more words I forget. This is always the issue. Like after some point, they all go away. So I'm gonna keep moving. But what's this word? You see, this is why I wish I was in the room, because I know somebody would tell me. But this is the issue of like making sure that your work is your work. Plagiarism, that's the word. Right? Make sure that you do not punish students for plagiarism, but then make sure that they are actually following through and doing the work that they have claimed to do. Caleb Moses down here is somebody we have worked with actually in the last iteration of this. So we held the same workshop at FACT in 2024 in Rio. And Caleb is Maori from New Zealand. And the Maori have a very, very, as many indigenous populations have, very interesting history with their language, right? Both like the disposition and then also how they managed to retain the languages that they were, their forefathers were banned from speaking, but they've retained it until now when these languages are being recognized. And for him, his thing was like, data sovereignty. This is not the kind of data set you're gonna find online, but this is a data set that you're gonna find, that they have as a community. And as he builds, how do I make sure that, we retain the rights and the benefits over this language? I've talked about, for example, Ivana, that's who was building for the course in Argentina. Asmelash is the one at Lesan, and Luciana, of course, I mentioned. Kathleen was actually a very interesting case too, because Kathleen, at the time she was a Mozilla fellow, and she was building for Swahili in Kenya. And Swahili also has this, so the spoken Swahili is actually not a real language, it's an amalgamation of languages. And the spoken Swahili that is spoken in East Africa, in Kenya, in Tanzania, and many other places, that Swahili was actually made up by colonial Britain. And so, but there are Swahili people in Kenya, and they speak very different. And her thing was making sure that you maintain the true roots of the language and making sure that you are ascribing the right people to the right languages. And she's Kenyan herself. And so this sort of like making sure the history in the language is properly preserved, that was something that was very important for her. So we see this diversity of concerns from the people who build, and they embed all of these into their systems. So we run these workshops, and some of the things that we're interested in these workshops is we have a bunch of, we have people in and we give them a card, and usually they don't know who the person who wrote the card is, and it has a scenario. The thing we wanted, I know that's a lot of text. I apologize. It makes better sense when you have the text on hand. But anyway, the thing we wanted to do was to give people this kind of a scenario where the builder made a choice that might not necessarily be obvious to people who did not necessarily understand the culture and the context. But also we wanted to highlight this as one of the strengths that a local builder brings, because I think a lot of the time when we speak about building locally, we speak about the lack of resources, the lack all the time. But there is a specific strength that these people bring, and we wanted to say, all right, here's a situation. Then afterwards, the attendees then get the scenario, and then we get a little voting, and we can discuss afterwards. But afterwards, one of the things that we do, we bring in each one of these speakers to come and tell us why they made the choice that they make. And this is where we've been getting all these stories, from Caleb about, his uncle being one of the elders in the community, and therefore, being trusted, having been trusted through generational and generational knowledge. And now he's one of the, the people who's doing language modeling there, and he's been brought in and he's been trusted to be the person who can steer through this in a careful and in that careful manner. And we have, so for example, you see this was Caleb's situation, surfing in a sea of data and all of the options that you might decide to do. And we have to think about not just this about who you work with, it's also the thing of like which platforms do you build for, what's gonna be your supply chain rule that you use. Is all of these things that are very granular, that are very technical, that then lead us to see the products that look incredibly different coming from the people who are building. And a lot of the time, incredibly different from the tools that we see from the big tech companies. That is the end of my speech. And we have this thing at DAIR about what is our imagined possible future? What sort of AI do you dream to see? What is the AI for you that makes sense for you and your community? And you can see more about our work at our DAIR website, and these are all the places to see their work. But I think in summary, I just want to say, I hope we can look a little bit further when we're thinking about tools that are not built in English, tools that are not built in Chinese, tools that are not built in the big places that are producing AI, and look at the local builders and what they are building. Because so far, what I have observed is they are actually building better tools, but it is not very often that we hear about these. And I thank you all for the invitation, and I'll take questions.
Thank you, Nyalleng. Can you hear me, Nyalleng?
I can.
Great.
Should I
Okay.
stop presenting?
Nope, you can keep your
Okay.
slides up, or I mean, just in case someone has a question that you want to pull up a slide for. Does anybody have any questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
So I'm a little bit of a novice with AI, but listening to you talk about moving away just from the data sets, strikes me that some of the tools you seem to be looking at are what might be called traditional AI. Is that one of the considerations in this picture?
I think, yes. So one of the things you will see is that many of the projects that I speak about, they are firstly informed by the problem that the people want to solve. So they're fairly problem specific. In terms of the actual technologies that are being used, they are all over. For example, Lilapa AI is building generative models. They're just focusing on specific languages for that. The affiliate was meant to be incorporated into large scale building. So it's not necessarily, I mean, sometimes you can have a certain model like have specific behavior, but it's not necessary. I guess maybe actually that's the thing about like traditional and non-traditional, because you can have a small generative model and you can have a big one, and you can have all different sizes, and you can do all of the traditional things with these. You can classify, you can predict. So I guess maybe I struggle with the difference between traditional and non-traditional. I don't know what the alternative is. But actually, maybe I can just say something there. Maybe the difference is not traditional or non-traditional. The difference is built for purpose, specific, built for a specific task versus general purpose models. I think that's one of the biggest things. So for example, Claude is a general purpose model, whereas, some of the models that you see will be specific. Lilapa, I think, is building general purpose models. Inside the general purpose models, they do, then they'll build for finance and they'll build for, specific things. So you see it all the time in other companies. So I think maybe that would be the difference between, the general purpose foundational model versus for purpose something. And yes, when you build with low resources and in these kinds of ways, it makes sense to build for purpose. There's not enough data to build general purpose.
Hello, my name is Xiaofan Liang. I have a question for you. So you asked at the end of a presentation, what will the possible future to be, right? So I'm curious of that question to you, because for a lot of the developer who develop these alternative small scale models, it's impossible to expect every single one of them to be an entrepreneur and fully deploy this model to be commercial, right? So a lot of them are more agile and research based. So what will be a good possible future for these kind of development? Like, should big company acquire them? Should they, should we have incubator to support them to end up doing all kinds of startups? So what's your vision?
It's a great question. That's a really great question, actually. And I don't think it's necessarily one that I have a solution for. I think one of the ways to think about it is what is the problem that's bugging you? I have specific problems that bug me, and then I want to build for those specific problems. but I am also a researcher. And so maybe, I'm not always thinking about making my living through that solution. It's just like, I just have this and I just want to see like a prototype of it. But the other thing I know that smaller entities are doing is that they're forming consortiums. So for example, Lelapa is in partnership with Lesan, with Ghana NLP, with a whole bunch of them. And what they're trying to do is to form a consortium and be the providers of, African NLP. So, I think things like those, whether or not big tech should buy you, it's a lot of money. This is the thing. These are personal decisions. It just depends on your own feeling. There's people who just don't feel that big tech should be amassing that much power, and so might hesitate. The other alternative is that actually this was a big thing that was coming out now at the AI Action Summit was building for public for public infrastructure, so like public service, right? So now you'd be building, and then some of these things would be partially like owned by, I don't know, like the government, the what, but like you're not building it for the tech companies. You're actually just building a solution, and maybe you sell it to some other entity that is like in the government or something like that.
Got another question over here.
Hi, Nyalleng. I'm Jing Liu from Midas. We've been emailing. And so I have a question about what you think about small models to support resource poor communities. When you were talking about local data, when you were talking about a lot of contextual information that are not necessarily caught in sort of the formalized data sets, that actually reminds me of some of the work we've done with the Native American tribal nations. And they face exactly the same challenge with collecting data that's most relevant to them and also incorporating their tribal knowledge. So how do you think, do you think whether it's possible for smaller models that can be deployed easily locally to help in some way?
Yes, no, for sure. I am definitely a fan of that kind of setup. So there is, you see, it's just also because of where we are now in the AI conversation and hype and everything. Like I said, the real solution of the problems of the people in the margins of society, or it's actually really kind of weird to speak about that as an African, because like Africans in Africa are not in the margins. We are the core. So, but anyway, like the real solutions are actually the solutions that are built within. And one of the things I think is to just change. We've got to change about what we want AI for. We have been recently just been told a lot about the general purpose AI and the powers of general purpose AI. And it feels like the general purpose AI is going to solve all the problems, but it's not going to. It's not going to. It cannot. There's not enough data. It really, honestly, just cannot. And there are many, many, many technical things about how it is currently being built that makes it so that it actually cannot. So this is why, for example, one of the things that we're seeing that's been very successful is the idea of building it as an ensemble, right? Build it as an ensemble. And what's an ensemble? It's many small experts, right? Because you get these like interference once you like scale up too. So I really do think, like, for communities who are interested in, like, so, and I actually do think there is a lot of profit to still be made, because remember that majority of the world population is in the margin, which is kind of weird to say, right? Majority of the world populations are these people who are underdocumented. And then you build for these, and there's very little competition for these. So that's the first thing. It's like you're building for specific problems, and a lot of the time, because these problems are understudied, there's lots of low-hanging fruit, lots of great places to immediately make improvement. Second thing is we are going to continue running into this if we care, which is the issue of making sure that our models are actually governable, and also that they are right, that we are not leaking privacy, for example, that we can actually audit the models and we can figure out how we got there, right? That there is transparency. All of these things are so much easier to do with much smaller task-focused models. And we really should not belittle them, because one of the things that we have to remember is even this AlphaFold, which just won the Nobel Prize, right? This is it is a specific model using deep learning, using specific data sets. It's not a full all-purpose model. It's not for everything. It was specifically built for this, and it is specifically optimized for this. And every time we have to build for precision, high precision, where this counts, we do actually have to be thinking of separating this thing into specific and task focus, and sometimes even smaller. Like it just really, it will also depend on what are our priorities here. Do we want to do okay over everything, or do we want to do really great over something?
Do we have any other questions?
So yeah, building on then what you're saying, so then how you say a little more about how you're thinking about data sovereignty? Because obviously that becomes increasingly a problem.
Data sovereignty is so difficult. You see, the problem is that we're foregoing copyright laws, right? One of the ways that people were thinking to do data sovereignty was to have licensing, right? To have IP and then have licenses, develop licenses. I know this is the case here. The Maori have been running a licensing model for a while out of New Zealand. That's what people who have this precious data that is not just like found on the internet have been doing. The thing is, if it ever comes out anywhere, I mean, for example, Asmelash had built a bunch of, that data set with Tigrinya. That data set got gulped up, by all the other entities, when they found it online. So data sovereignty is a really, really tough one without copyright laws, because what are you going to do? Are you going to go completely offline? Or maybe you're going to put it all store in containers that are locked on, on the cloud, and hope that at least the laws of privacy still hold if the laws of copyright don't hold. These are things we all have to think about, because this is what we are kind of allowing. And I mean, like, these big tech companies are incredibly powerful. So that's the thing. These are part of the discussions of, decoloniality or recolonization. All of these things are like coming up now. But I honestly do not know how you guarantee, without being completely offline, how you guarantee that you've got sovereignty of your data. Because if New York Times is suing, and Condé Nast is suing, these small entities, I don't know.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, Nyalleng. That was a wonderful talk, and thank you for answering everyone's questions.
Thanks so much, Ben. And thanks, everybody.